Hi, my name is Ruth, and today we are joined by Fabio Battista, the editor and translator of our newest publication in the Lorenzo da Ponte Italian Library, Queen of Scots. So welcome, Professor Battista.
Thank you for having me, Ruth.
Thank you. Can you briefly tell us about your research interests and how you got to this text?
Sure. So my job is I'm a professor of Italian language and literature at the University of Alabama. And my main focus as far as research really is early modern studies. In particular, I've been interested, and I am still interested in how news, specifically political news and religious news, was treated as the source for artistic creation in early modern times, specifically roughly between 1500 and 1700. The main focus within this category of my research has been Anglo-Italian relations. So specifically how English or Scottish, or let's say Anglo-inspired news became a source for commentary, cultural commentary, artistic creation in coeval Italy. Specifically, as I mentioned, I landed on one of the texts on which I landed was La Reina di Scozia, the Queen of Scots, which I translated. And the reason why I did is because this is one of the most important, if not the most important, early modern literary text, specifically dealing with this aspect, the intercultural communication between Italy and England, and particularly regarding matters of religious history, which was the case with Mary, Queen of Scots, religious history that also had political connotations. Very important, actually, political connotations.
That sounds very complex, but also very interesting.
It's actually not that complex. I like to think about it as, if you know the Tudors or the Netflix shows that deal with things that are long gone. It's kind of the same aspect, but in specifically in literature more than anything.
Could you also maybe say a few words to introduce Federico Della Valle, the author of the play,
Sure.
to an English-speaking audience who might not be familiar with his works?
Of course. I will add that an Italian audience would not be particularly familiar with his works either. He is what perhaps the most prominent, if not one of the most prominent dramatists of his period. So he lived essentially in at the turn between the 16th and the 17th century, but he's roughly considered a 17th century, early 17th century author mostly. He had a diplomatic career. He was quite close with the Savoy family in northern Italy, who were the rulers of that area. And so he was well familiar with matters of international affairs, which was not a coincidence that he ended up picking up the story of Mary, Queen of Scots as one of the motives for his creations. Mary, Queen of Scots, however, La Reina di Scozia was kind of his one foray outside of the biblical genre. His other dramatic works are biblically inspired, Judith and Esther, so they kind of deal with mostly female figures from the Bible. And as I mentioned before, the case of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was put to death in 1587, and she became a Catholic martyr, essentially. And that is one of the reasons why Della Valle, in my opinion at least, decided to kind of look at even roughly his contemporary, for a source of inspiration rather than just the biblical aspects. Because some of the religious aspect, like the themes were kind of similar, and he was familiar with this material.
So what makes Queen of Scots, I guess, distinct in terms of maybe conventions and themes from early modern Italian dramas? And what unique elements does it bring to the genre?
Sure. So La Reina di Scozia really is quite classical in its conception and in its structure. For instance, if you're familiar with Greek tragedy, you will notice some recurring elements. For instance, the chorus. There is a chorus that is very, very important actually in this tragedy. It's not just a convention. It does really carry a very important role. Another aspect that goes back to classical tragedy is the lack of internal partition. So there are no acts, there are no scenes. This is a continuous, it's a continuous text, really. And another aspect that is kind of remarkable is that although this is a dramatic text, a tragedy specifically, this was never performed in its entirety, and most likely it was intended to be read. So it's a little bit of a difference. So that is a difference with regard to Greek tragedy, which was very much meant for performance. And another point of continuity, though, is the culmination in terms of dramatic action is the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, this execution does not happen on stage, and that is something that is not peculiar to Della Valle. That also comes after centuries and centuries and centuries of theoretical discussions, starting with Aristotle, really, about showing violence on stage. So for instance, as I mentioned, the execution is narrated. So rather than showing, we are told of what happens. This is taking place outside of the stage and is reported by one of the characters who narrates with great detail, quite gory, actually, detail as well, how the head was severed from the head. So it's not necessarily, the problem was not necessarily violence, but rather the showing of violence on stage.
So you talked a little bit about executions and, Queen of Scots is like a historical drama. Yes. And historical, I guess, works or historical dramas often blur the lines between fact and fiction. So how does Federico Della Valle balance historical accuracy with his creative choices in this book?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, you've said it already. So, like, as is customary with historical fiction, there will be many, many divergences between the fact and its representation. In the case of the Queen of Scots, Della Valle really takes few elements from the actual history that he could have accessed, which was enormous because this was a very, very, very important event on a European, in a European perspective, not just for the British Isles. So you can see that there are a number of characters that are based on, or loosely based, I should say, on their historical counterparts. Most of the characters are. There are, however, some exceptions, but most of the characters have some kind of grounding in reality. As far as how accurate this tragedy is, not very accurate. Also because it concentrates on the very, very last hours of Mary, Queen of Scots' life, essentially condensing in those very few hours events and developments that had happened over the course of weeks, if not months. The very imprisonment of Mary, Queen of Scots was almost a 20-year affair, and there was lots of deliberation. There was lots of hesitation on the part of Elizabeth, the Queen of England, in finally signing the death warrant. So this is not necessarily portrayed in Della Valle's work, which is understandable and fine, because we don't necessarily want a history lesson. We want to be entertained. today. But at the time, I would say that Della Valle, I would be pretty confident in guessing that he absolutely had a pedagogical intention behind his creation, so not just entertainment. So the historical elements are essentially used to make his argument, right? To advance his ideological agenda, his ideological positions. So yes, history is very much present. This is rooted in history. In reality, though, the narrative, the dramatic fiction does not necessarily bear that much resemblance to the actual fact. If not for the essential elements, Mary Queen of Scots was put to death. Very true. The sentence was read and was signed by her cousin, the Queen of England. That is all true. The details, not so much.
How has this dramatic reinterpretation of Mary Queen of Scots' death contributed then to the enduring legacy and fascination surrounding her story?
Sure. So this, I failed to mention it earlier, but this is, to my knowledge, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but so far that hasn't happened. But to my knowledge, that is the Queen of Scots, La Reina di Scozia, is the earliest dramatic representation of Mary Queen of Scots in a modern vernacular. I know, I have located one prior tragedy written in Latin, but that was never printed, and that was performed, but it was never printed. So it's just a manuscript. It was intended as a school play. So I think we can safely state that it is Federico Della Valle that begins the literary canonization of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, this process, however, is not necessarily the process essentially that takes us from Della Valle in, if we go by the printed version, 1628, if we go by the earlier manuscript, already 1591. So from there until today, because as you mentioned correctly, the Mary Queen of Scots myth is very much alive in popular culture still, is not a straight line. There are a number of kind of obscure places. I would not go, for instance, I would not be so bold as to claim that it is because of Federico Della Valle that Mary Queen of Scots was canonized as an enduring source of interest, fascination, and creation. That would be inaccurate. But what the existence itself of the Queen of Scots must be inscribed into a greater interest in the episode of the death of Mary Queen of Scots, which bespeaks to a fascination that was apparently as relevant today, and it was as relevant at the time as it is today. I would also, though, qualify how different Della Valle's interpretation of Mary Queen of Scots is to our own. Which is perfectly natural, centuries later, have tended to secularize this episode. For instance, the religious aspects are not necessarily the ones that are most of interest. For instance, if you are familiar with a movie that came out not too many years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, which is entitled American of Scots specifically, which was a major motion picture. The religious aspect is there because it's inevitable. It's part of the motor, but it's not really the focus. It's not really the main interest. In Della Valle this is very much the focus. He, in this tragedy, was trying, at least in my mind, he was trying to portray the dramatic opposition, the contrast at play between the Reformed Europe and Catholic Europe. So obviously from the perspective and on the side of Catholics against Protestants. So Mary Queen of Scots and her tragic death, she was a Catholic, and she came to embody really this struggle very, very prominently. However, just to conclude briefly your question, I would say that we cannot really talk about Mary Queen of Scots and her fortune, her myth, without mentioning one name, which is not Federico Della Valle, but Friedrich Schiller. So same first name, one in Italian, one in German, but two very different people from different periods. His tragedy, Maria Stuart, which was written in 1800, that is what actually stimulated a more enduring tradition, really, regarding Mary Queen of Scots, and essentially was responsible for the rebirth of this myth after the enormous popularity that it had enjoyed in Della Valle's time and throughout the 17th century. There are a number of works written about Mary Queen of Scots, but if we care about Mary Queen of Scots still today, I would think it's actually probably more due to Friedrich Schiller than it is to Federico Della Valle, which doesn't cancel the fact that Della Valle's work really was a pioneer in this genre.
Thinking about how, you translated Della Valle's work, can you share any interesting anecdotes about the translation process, or if there were any specific passages or terms that presented unique challenges when translating from Italian to English?
Oh, that's a dense question. Okay, I will be very honest. I don't have any funny anecdotes. I wish I did, but I don't. However, I can comment on the fact that translating is never easy, even no matter what type of text you're translating. Specifically, when you're translating literature, and literature that was produced centuries ago with a very different language, for instance, than contemporary Italian, the challenges grow, right, exponentially there. My biggest challenge, probably in terms of as a translator, my biggest challenge was not necessarily how to translate, let's say, a word or specific passages in the text, but more I was trying, and I hope I somehow managed to strike a balance between being respectful of the original text, which is very difficult in Italian. I would argue that many native speakers of Italian would have a difficult time reading the Queen of La Reina di Scozia. So this is an aspect that I had to take into consideration, and I did not want to ignore. If the text is difficult, there needs to remain a certain level of difficulty. However, I am also very aware that texts, if they're not read, they die. Therefore, as I mentioned, I was trying to strike a balance between maintaining some of the difficulty, but also being aware of a live, contemporary, non-Italian speaking audience. So I had to try to explain a few things a little bit more. I had to put a little bit extra effort into making sure that I'm not just saying the words or giving my version of the words as Della Valle wrote them, but making sure that they actually made some sense. A big challenge was syntax. This, Della Valle wrote in the late 16th century, with the re-elaborations in the early 17th century. So the structure itself of the language is very different from contemporary Italian. There are lots of metaphors. It's a very, very educated text. This is not the author is someone who clearly knew a lot and was a talented poet, which was great, but also makes it challenging to transpose into a different language. If I can think of one aspect that I have to say somewhat struggled with, was names, because you asked before about the relation between this text and its historical source. Names are the first connection there, right? So as I mentioned, a lot of the characters are historically grounded, and their names are Italianized. Now, this works fine in most cases, but there have been a couple of instances where I genuinely did not know who the historical reference was behind this clearly English name that was Italianized. One such example is not actually in the tragedy in La Reina di Scozia, but it's in an appendix, which is included in the book. There is an appendix, which is a letter written by someone. I will cut it short. It's a letter detailing the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. And in this letter, there is a name, the name of a certain earl, or conte in Italian. And his name, Conte di Mestrice, to this day, I really do not know who that is, who it was intended to be. And mind you, this is not in a literary text. This is in a letter, a nonfiction. This is not supposed. So this kind of challenge, which I embrace because this is one of the fun things actually of working with historical texts, you have to play detective a little bit, right? And trying to figure out who were you guys thinking about? Especially when we're talking about an Italian writing about a non-Italian subject. So while I cannot say that I really struggled terribly with some specific word or specific passage, the struggles were more evenly distributed throughout the operation. But, you know, one is, again, the names and what they may or may not indicate.
Well, thank you for sharing. And thank you for coming here today to discuss with us this remarkable publication. Queen of Scots is out now through the University of Toronto Press in the Lorenzo da Ponte Italian Library. And you can find it wherever you get your books, in person or online. Thank you.
Thank you.